Bullseye with Jesse Thorn is a production of MaximumFun.org and is distributed by NPR.
I'm Jesse Thorn. It's Bullseye. If you have a computer or phone in front of you, do me a favor. Do a web search for the term dairy restaurant. A dairy restaurant, for the record, is a kind of kosher restaurant that serves, well, dairy for starters. Other stuff too, but no meat. Many observant Jews avoid mixing meat and milk to keep kosher, so a dairy restaurant serves a really useful purpose. But like I said, look up the term on the web. If you're looking for a history on those places, what kind of food they served, you won't find much. Instead, you'll see maybe a few listings for restaurants in your area, some travel guides, but no Wikipedia page, no dictionary definition. It's almost like they aren't really a thing, or that they're lost to time. But they are a thing, or were at least. There used to be a bunch of them in New York City and in other places where first-generation Jewish immigrants came to the U.S., but cities change, people change, restaurants come, restaurants go. Ben Katchor, the cartoonist behind the wonderful, brilliant strip Julius Knipl, Real Estate Photographer, remembers them. He misses them, and he talks about those places in his newest book, The Dairy Restaurant. It's an illustrated history of dairy restaurants, what they served, what role they played, and what they mean to him. It's an expansive, lyrical, elegiac book with text and lots and lots and lots of graphics. And it hits on some of the themes that Katchor loves most, the ones that animated Julius Knipl and won Katchor a MacArthur Fellowship some time ago. The ways our lives are shaped by urban environments and the way that memories of places gone remain where those places are. All of the things that make cities magical. It's a beautiful book. I'm really thrilled to talk with Ben Katchor. He's truly a hero of mine. Let's get into our interview. Ben Katchor, welcome to Bullseye. I'm so happy to have you on the show. I'm such a fan of your work.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
So I want to start with a pretty plain and simple question, which is your book is a history of the dairy restaurant. It's also much more than that, but it's primarily concerned with the dairy restaurant and how it came to be. What is a dairy restaurant?
Well, the dairy restaurants that I knew as a young person growing up in New York were this kind of amalgam of the idea of a restaurant crossed with Jewish dietary law. And so they served a cuisine that was limited to non-meat dishes, but including fish. So milk, all kinds of milk stuffs, grains, vegetables, fruits, baked goods, and all kinds of fish, just not meat or chicken. And this was a particular Eastern European cuisine that they offered. And, they were always there, and I assumed as a child, they had always existed. And then as I got older, I guess in my late 20s, early 30s, they all started disappearing. And now there are not too many of that particular kind left. But that's what they were. They were sort of the alternative place to go if you didn't want to eat delicatessen or meat, heavy meat.
We normally record our show at our office, which is across MacArthur Park from Langer's Delicatessen, maybe the best Jewish deli in Los Angeles. What's the difference between the food that they serve at a deli and the food they serve at a dairy restaurant?
Well, a delicatessen is a meat-based cuisine, pastrami, brisket, corned beef. And very early on, these were kind of, there's a kind of Jewish-style restaurant that came about in the 60s that served everything, all mixed together. They weren't observant Jews running those places. Not that the people who ran the dairy restaurants were, but they kind of stuck to this cuisine. You know, it would be like going into any ethnic restaurant and seeing things on the menu that just didn't belong. So, and then there's also a bit of an overlap with the history of vegetarian restaurants, because Jewish dietary law can be seen as a kind of modified vegetarianism. That's just because, you know, dealing with meat and slaughtering animals, there's a much more elaborate kind of rituals you have to go through. If you eat a piece of lettuce, it just should be clean, and it doesn't involve all of that. But and so the difference in terms of atmosphere is that, you know, it's an ancient idea that if meat eating makes you more aggressive and more repetitive and more predatory, and milk eaters with a more mild-mannered, ruminative kinds of people. And, you know, in Yiddish, there are all these expressions, you know, bleiben auf der milchdicker Bank. And that means the person who didn't really enter the world, they just stayed on the dairy bench or table. And, you know, and if you wanted to make a business deal with someone, that would be machen fleischig. You know, let's have a drink. Let's get down to meat eating. So these are ancient differentiations. You know, a delicatessen smelled of roasting meat and poultry and chicken fat, and a dairy smelt of frying butter and sweet fish. So
these restaurants rose partly out of Jewish dietary law and, you know, relatively recent Jewish immigrants from Europe who were looking for a place to eat that adhered to it. They also have a kind of a deep connection with end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century ideas about food purity and health food. What was the relationship between those ideas and these restaurants?
Well, I didn't know anything about this worldwide history of dairy-based restaurants when I started thinking about writing this history. But it turns out that everywhere in the world that there were restaurants, or at least these kind of semi-public eating places, there were restaurants oriented toward dairy and milk products. And so if you look back at history in France, there were the cremerie that became a kind of restaurant. There were the Milchhallen in Germany and Austria. There were these Milczania in Poland. These were places that one of their specialties was fresh milk, and this is before electronic refrigeration and fast transport of milk. And so these places claimed to have connections with dairy farms, and so they could provide a fresh glass of milk or cream and a few dairy-based dishes. Nothing in terms of a menu to do with the Jewish dairy restaurant, because they were not run by observant Jews or considering Jewish dietary law. They'd have ham sandwiches on the menu also. So this interest in fresh milk and pure milk. I mean, there was a pure food movement in the late 19th century. There was a lot of food adulteration, and some of these restaurants claim to offer purer food or cleaner food, but I think the impulse that I sort of traced behind all of these places was something I just call the pastoral impulse, wanting to go back to this kind of pre-industrial world where you could get pure food. And, in the book, I trace it back to the Garden of Eden and that impulse, at least in Western culture.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense if you imagine the world of the late 19th century and early 20th century as people were starting to live in cities rather than on farms. On farms, people had direct access to their food, so they knew exactly what it was. In cities, there were intermediary steps, and, like the rise of white bread, for example, is basically, as I understand it, I'm not a food historian, but is basically because people wanted to buy the whitest bread they could because a lot of the bread was being made with sawdust mixed with the flour. And if your bread was white, it proved that there wasn't sawdust in it. You know what I mean? And having a gleaming white restaurant that looks like a healthful dairy farm, that looks like a place where the milk is coming from the cows in a sanitary environment, which was so important because the adulterated milk, it could make you very sick, was like it was the same kind of impulse, that impulse to avoid the possibility of sawdust in your bread. Yeah.
Milk is an interesting substance. It's a perfect medium to grow tuberculosis, bacilli, and other pathogens in, and it could be traced. Milk sickness and milk, and these other diseases could be traced back to adulterated or diseased milk. But it was also part of a culture of the milk cure, and where milk drinking was sort of limiting your dietary intake to just to milk, or this first food, the first thing people eat as children, would have a curative effect. And ideally, it should be milk from a certain place in the Alps in Switzerland, and that started the whole industry of these health resorts in all over Europe. The milk cure, there were grape cures, there were all kinds of cures where you try to fine-tune somebody's dietary intake so that you could cure them of whatever they were suffering from.
Are there still dairy restaurants in New York?
Well, since it's a worldwide phenomenon, the definition is constantly changing. And now in New York and in other places where there are numbers of Jews, there are these things called kosher pizzerias, where they'll have basically an Italian menu. Maybe they'll have a few remnants of Eastern European food like knishes or potato kugel. And then there's another kind of upscale dairy restaurant that you'll see in Orthodox neighborhoods, which offers world cuisine. I mean, sushi can be served in a dairy restaurant. So, it can open up to other cuisines, not just the kind of food that I knew in those, the dairy restaurants of the 60s, 70s, 80s.
You grew up with a dad who ran an apartment building, which he eventually turned into a commune.
Well, he tried. It wasn't sort of in his hands to do it. It was in the hands of the people he wanted to sort of give this to. And that was not terribly successful. But he was one of these people involved in the Yiddish end of what's called communism, with a small c, because the International Workers' Order had a Yiddish language division. They published a newspaper, the Freiheit. They had all kinds of literary clubs and musical clubs. It was summer camps. It was kind of a whole complete cultural world. And, somewhere behind it all was this ideal of a classless society, and maybe the end of private property. But most of the people, at least according to some historians who were in this IWO, were not members of the American Communist Party. They were small business people, they were workers, they were all kinds of people. When I hear stories about people joining the American Communist Party, it's not something I was familiar with from my father, because it was more of an ideological connection with this idea. It happened to be being played out in the Soviet Union at that time, and so there was a lot of interest in that experiment. When communists, especially these Yiddish communists, could clearly differentiate in their mind between the bureaucracy of, the Soviet Union and the economics of the Soviet Union. There were two that you could divide them in your mind, I guess, and say one is really something we should be aiming for, the other is becoming corrupt, like any bureaucracy can become corrupt.
We'll finish up my interview with Ben Katchor after a short break. When we return, Ben is a lifelong New Yorker who loves to walk around his great city. He'll tell us the first place he plans to go when his hometown opens up again. It's Bullseye for MaximumFun.org and NPR.
Hey, it's Guy Raz from NPR's How I Built This, and each week on the show during this unprecedented crisis, I'll be asking some of the top founders and builders how they're dealing with the economic impact of the coronavirus and hear about some of the ways they're pivoting to fight it. Subscribe or listen now to How I Built This.
You wept as we crafted the tragic tale of Jar Jar, a Star Wars story.
Doing like he forgives Darth Vader. Lisa still love you, Annie.
You gasped out loud at the shocking twists of Face Off 2, Faces Wild. He takes his kid's face.
What?
Now we're writing an entire screenplay week by week on Storybricks Season 2, Heaven Heist. Hey folks, Freddie Wong here with some exciting news about Storybreak, the Writers' Room podcast where three Hollywood professionals have 1 hour to spin cinematic gold. We're shaking up our format by turning Heaven Heist, one of our favorite ideas we've ever come up with on the show, into a full screenplay.
Heaven Heist is an action comedy about a crew of misfit gangsters robbing the celestial bank of heaven. Think Coco meets Point Break.
Join us as we write this crazy movie scene by scene and get an inside look at the screenwriting process on our podcast Storybreak every Thursday on MaximumFun.org.
You're listening to Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. My guest is Ben Katchor. He's a cartoonist and a MacArthur Fellow. He's got a great new book out called The Dairy Restaurant. It's a visual history of kosher dairy restaurants. Katchor also created one of my favorite comics of all time, Julius Knipl, Real Estate Photographer. Here's a clip from the audio version of the strip, which aired on NPR in the 1990s. Ben provides the narration. Actor Jerry Stiller plays the titular character. In this clip, Canibble and his new friend Samson Kohler are spending the day delighting in their favorite pastime, riding New York City department store escalators.
A wooden Treps mill in the rear of the Leakron Hotel.
They don't build them like this anymore. Smooth as butter.
To walk ahead and feel the combined force of one's foot meeting the rising tread.
The high-speed Ophir in the lobby of 527 Mycia Avenue.
Whoa! Hold on to your hats. We must be doing 50 miles an hour.
Or to induce a moment of giddy stasis by walking up a down escalator. While a few imagined that they might someday win the sponsorship of a famous manufacturer and continue riding on a professional basis.
I could do 6 months of the year in New York.
Julius Knipl which was your very long-running comic strip that was collected into a number of books, is concerned with this kind of underlayer of like the ephemeral world of cities and buildings, businesses with weird names that may or may not have gone out of business 20 years ago, things like that. And I wonder what it's like to be in New York now in 2020, maybe outside of the context of the current not going outside rules, but to be in New York in, let's say, 2019, and be in an environment where so much of the city, especially Manhattan, is so shiny compared to what it was like even just 20 years ago.
Well, it's incredibly boring if you knew another version of the city. I mean, it's a bank, basically a bank, a drugstore chain, a chain coffee shop. I mean, it's the malling of the city. It's you may as well be in a shopping mall in a lot of Manhattan. When you have to sort of head pretty far uptown to get the semblance of a neighborhood that's not completely chain stores. So it's incredibly boring. I mean, there are more the boroughs, things still go on in the boroughs. So I love to go out to Brooklyn. And I grew up in Brooklyn, so I would go out there or parts of Queens. This impulse that I'm talking about to, endlessly move yourself up economically and socially is kind of, it's ruined large parts of the city.
I have a fashion website, and sometimes people will ask me why I like buying thrift store clothes so much, and it's something that I had never examined for myself, because I had just done it since, my mom used to work at a store in a fancy neighborhood where there were fancy thrift stores, and that's where most of my clothes came from. So it was just sort of my whole life. But I thought about it because, sometimes people will say like, well, how can you wear whatever, someone else's shoes? That's gross. And it is gross. So I grant them that. However, there is something too, and it's something that I recognize in Julius Knipl, the idea that when something has had a life before it came into your life, whether it's a storefront that you're walking past, or, a pair of trousers that you buy at a thrift store, you maybe can infer some things about that life, but you also are telling yourself a story about it, and there's a sense of possibility and magic in creating that story, or guessing at what it might be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other thing you'd notice if you read this gigantic list of 200, vanished dairy restaurants is that there was a moment when you could open up a very eccentric kind of restaurant and nobody would say, why are you doing it like that? And, everyone was different. It was somebody's whim. This is how I want to set up my counter. They'd have a restaurant supply company build it to their specifications. And so, the idea of a chain coffee shop like Starbucks, it's just the death of invention. How could somebody with that much money not want to reinvent every store he opens? It's just it's this. That's the argument. The upper middle class, and the very wealthy become somehow very unambitious in their thought patterns. You could say it just makes them stupid. They don't want to think about this. They think that's the solution. That's what every Starbucks should look like. And, nothing could be more boring. I'll walk miles to avoid going into one of those places. Or any chain store. That just came to mind because they're sort of all over New York. The idea of individually invented businesses, they need to have a certain kind of rent. The whole, economy has to collapse for that to happen. And, maybe it will. I doubt it in this moment because the wealthiest corporations were just given this gigantic bailout. And I think a lot of small businesses that still are around, they won't be able to endure a couple of months being closed, not doing business. So. But anyway, in the 50s, there were whole neighborhoods in Manhattan, the garment district, and where you could run these strange restaurants. And, run them the way your idea of a restaurant. So, that's something that I kind of miss.
When we're going outside again, what are the places that you think you would most like to spend some time?
Restaurants. I love restaurant culture. To me, it's this perfect kind of social purpose to gather together in a place. It's not a party. Nobody's, footing the bill. Everybody's paying for their own meal. Nobody can be excluded from the party. You come and go as you like. You eat what you want. The invention of the menu lets you choose what you want to eat. Yeah, so I'll be... I'm dreaming about restaurants, invented restaurants. It's really strange. I really miss. That's something I miss.
Well, Ben, I'm so grateful to you for taking this time. I love the book, and I am really a huge fan of your work for many, many, many years, and I really appreciate it. It's nice to get to talk to you.
I was wondering who was buying all my books. No, I always wonder who these people are.
Ben Katchor, his new book, The Dairy Restaurant, is available for purchase now. It's absolutely beautiful, an expansive, meandering story that starts in the Garden of Eden, literally in the Garden of Eden, and proceeds from there. You can also find new and secondhand compilations of his other comic, Julius Knipl, Real Estate Photographer, which is one of the most beautiful things I have ever read. I've got them all, and I love them absolutely to death. They capture what is beautiful and amazing about living in a city, the sort of ghosts that we live with and the stories imagined and otherwise. They're really wonderful. That's the end of another episode of Bullseye. Bullseye is currently being produced out of the homes of myself and the other employees of Maximum Fun Incorporated in and around the Los Angeles area. Here at my house, the most exciting thing that happened this past week was a delivery of hams from Father's Country Hams. Always exciting, but particularly exciting when you're not leaving the house very much. Thanks to Father's Country Hams of Bremen, Kentucky. They didn't give them to me for free. I bought them. I got all the cracklings and ham and bacon and biscuits and, oh man, I gotta go eat. The show is produced by Speaking Into Microphones. Our producer is Kevin Ferguson. Jesus Ambrosio is our associate producer. We had help from Casey O'Brien and Jordan Cowling at Maximum Fun. Our interstitial music is by Dan Wally, aka DJ W. Our theme song is by the Go Team. Thanks to them and their label Memphis Industries for letting us use it. And we have so many interviews in our back catalogs. I talked with Zach Galifianakis about his part in The Hangover. He had a very different perspective on how the movie changed his life. You can listen to that conversation at our website, MaximumFun.org. If you're a fan of comics, we've interviewed many, many comics creators, many of the best on Bullseye over the years, from Art Spiegelman to Dan Clowes, Lisa Hannawalt, the great Linda Barry, Adrian Tomine, all kinds of cool people. You can find all those also on our website, MaximumFun.org, or in your favorite podcast app. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We're at Bullseye on Twitter, so go follow us there. You can search for Bullseye with Jesse Thorn on Facebook, and all the interviews on this show are on our YouTube channel, so you can go grab them, share them there, subscribe there if that's how you prefer to enjoy radio interviews. And I think that's about it. Just remember, all great radio hosts have a signature sign-off.
Bullseye with Jesse Thorn is a production of MaximumFun.org and is distributed by NPR.